Okay, so one of the most common issues skeptics have with Christianity is how it appears that God commands genocide in the Old Testament. Right? It's not an easy thing to read. A lot of people struggle with this. They read the Old Testament, especially as we now get into the book of Joshua. There's a lot of conquests and battles and destruction, and they start to wonder, this is the God I'm supposed to worship? Like, it just doesn't feel right. And they really struggle with it. And it's a real legitimate struggle. And so at a quick glance, it just kind of seems what it is, right? Like God commands, Joshua, go in here, destroy these people, that kind of stuff, right? So it seems really troubling, but how do we look at it, right? I think Christians sometimes just try to like gloss over it, but it is troubling. Okay, and so what is going on here in Joshua chapters, the second half of chapter 5 all the way through chapter 8? What is going on? Is this fair criticism against God and against the Christian faith? So let's take a closer look at that specific question, before we actually jump into what's happening in those chapters. Okay? All right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try to do this with enough detail, but also fairly brief, because it is we can study this for a lot longer than just a few minutes here. Okay. All right. So to kind of properly explore this question of how do we deal with all of the death and destruction that God seems to command in the Old Testament, I think we want to look at it in two ways. Okay. There's the big picture, and then there is what's actually happening in this, okay? So big picture-wise, I think there's a couple of things we have to just understand and wrestle with in our heads and hearts, okay? I think the first one, the first issue is that God is sovereign, right? God is sovereign. And so if God is the Lord of all things, everywhere, all time of the universe, if God is Lord, then we do have to kind of accept that he has the authority and the right to decide what happens in that kind of stuff. Not everybody likes that, but that's like one of the first things we just have to kind of like deal with, right? Like, if God is Lord, then he has that authority, right? God is the one that sets what is right and what is wrong, right? And so if we sit there and say, no, these things are just wrong, and God is wrong in this, and he's being really terrible to call on his people to destroy these group of people. If we were to say that, you can say that. I'm not saying you can't. What I'm saying is if we decide to kind of take that position, we just have to be honest with ourselves that when we take that position, we are taking a position that is above God. Like, we are taking a position that says, I decide what is right and wrong, and not God. Right? And I think a lot of people would say that. A lot of people a lot of skeptics would say, well, I believe that there are universal truths that supersede all things, right? Like, killing is bad, right? Now, you can take that position, but the problem is you just have to at least say, well, what makes you, why, right? And you would have to say, well, there is something above God, and I kind of decided that. Now, if that's the position you take, that's fine. You're right. But I'm just saying we kind of have to at least be honest with ourselves that God kind of sets right and wrong. If you don't like that, then you're just in a role that decides that you're saying, I'm kind of taking the role of God and I'm deciding. Okay, and the problem is, like, the whole idea of God setting everything right and wrong. God created everything. God is sovereign. That's pretty foundational to the gospel. And so, like, exploring this question starts with the very foundation of your beliefs in God and in his sovereignty and the gospel and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like the first thing we have to understand, right? God is sovereign, and he kind of gets to decide what's right and wrong. Now, I would say this, if you're just not feeling it, like, I don't know, I would say as you explore God and explore the gospel, try to focus more on God's love, grace, and faithfulness, right? Because a lot of times people just focus on this one thing and they really struggle with it, but you got to focus also on God's love, grace, and faithfulness. And if you have that balance, a lot of times that stuff makes more sense, okay? The second point is that when we look at when God calls for destruction or whatever, is that we, and I say we as in humanity, we deserve justice, not mercy. A lot of times we look at things and we're like, well, I don't like this. It seems unfair. But if you look at our lives as in humanity, we deserve justice. I mean, that actually makes sense, right? I mean, if things bad happen, like we deserve justice. But we don't deserve mercy. Mercy, by definition, is not getting something that we do deserve, okay? And so that's it, right? So there's the big picture. You got God's sovereignty. You have the fact that we deserve justice and not mercy. And the third part of this big picture is that the Canaanites were enemies of God. Okay, it's sometimes tough to like just think about that, but no, the Canaanites were enemies of God, right? And so part of God's wrath in this whole these chapters where God is calling on destruction and that kind of stuff, it is divine judgment towards the Canaanites. Like there's a reason for it, right? The Canaanites were not innocent by a long shot. I think a lot of times we like to think of all cultures and all civilizations throughout history as basically neutral. And God, like, you're kind of being harsh on them, but it's not, right? The Canaanites, when you kind of start looking at what they kind of do, what they believe in, and their society, it's a real brutal society, right? I'm not going to go into the details, but like they went as far as child sacrifice. Like that was a part of what they believed to be perfectly fine and good, okay? And so, and again, like, and if you would have to then say, well, right and wrong is all kind of relative, and so child sacrifice maybe in our culture is not cool, but who am I to say, right? That argument starts to break down a bit once you actually look at the Canaanites as a group of people in the ancient times, okay? I mean, it's funny. I feel like as someone in the past who didn't have children, that like, oh, child sacrifice, like, oh yeah, that's bad. Once you become a parent, it's like anytime like children are hurt, we're just like, oh, I can't handle it, right? Like movies, when there are movies and like or stories where a central premise of the plot is children being hurt, it's like, nope, not gonna watch that, right? Before I became a parent, it's like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool, like it's bad, but like, well, the action's great. Now it's like, I can't watch that, right? And so I think there's something there, like when a society starts to just completely devalue like life and like children's lives, like there's a problem there, okay? And so the Canaanites weren't innocent in this, and so they're like this call for destruction by God is divine punishment on the Canaanites. We have to understand that, okay? And the last thing about the Canaanites is this: they had actually a lot of opportunity to change, right? This whole thing, the Canaanites were there in that area for hundreds of years, and so they, to say like, I think there's a point where you can't say, oh, they didn't know, it wasn't like they're sitting there going, oh, sacrificing my children? Is that bad? Because they're, like, I don't know that, right? They kind of knew, like they've made that decision, right? Because it became part of their worship, okay? And so they had hundreds of years, they had a long time to change and repent. Even when the Israelites started coming out of out of Egypt and were moving around to the promised land, they heard They heard about what God had done. They knew what the Israelites' goal was to come. They knew that this judgment was coming. And so they did actually have a lot of time to turn, and they didn't. Okay, so that's like the big picture. Okay, now let's take a look at what's actually happening. I think the first thing is it actually wasn't genocide, right? I think that word genocide just gets thrown around. It's like it has so many meanings now. It's like, it could have its technical official definition, but if you just like look at somebody cross-eyed, it's like, oh, you're like genociding me, It's like it technically wasn't genocide. Okay, there were actually different rules for battles inside and outside of the promised land. God didn't just say go and destroy everybody. Okay, and this is back in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10. God says, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. Okay, and so there were different rules where God would say, hey, this time this is total destruction. Other times, no, you make a offer of peace because this is not the promised land. This is not your land. We're just trying to get through. Okay, so there are different rules for different battles. Okay, and then there's also hyperbolic language. Right, hyperbole is just exaggeration. Okay, so sometimes when God says total destruction, He doesn't mean kill everybody and everything. It means a total defeat. It's kind of like how in sports today, we will say, oh man, our team got destroyed. Nobody says, oh my goodness, did the other team literally kill everybody? Coaches too? Like everybody's dead? And they're like, no. Like we just got beat really badly, And we're just like, oh, of course, right? That's the kind of language. But the problem is when we read in the Bible, sometimes we miss that, right? And you're like, wait a minute, how do we know it's hyperbolic language? Well, we'll read Joshua chapter 8, verse 35. We'll read that again later, but right now it says this, right? This is after all the battles, right? There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them, right? These are the kind of things where you have to pause and think, like, well, what is that saying? Well, I thought you killed everybody. Why are there foreigners there? Later on in the Bible, God will say, hey, don't intermarry with the foreigners because they have different faiths and you don't want to compromise your faith, right? And you're like, wait, but if total destruction meant killing everything, then they wouldn't even be there, right? And so sometimes there is total destruction. Sometimes there is total defeat, where it's just driving people out, and so it's not exactly like, hey, this is what's happening, right? It's not technically genocide, okay? And now the point of all this, right? When we look at what's actually happening, the point of all this is that God is calling the Israelites to drive the Canaanites completely out of the land. So they know, when I say completely, again, I don't mean like every single one of them. It's that the completely meaning like they will not have any influence on the people, right? Because there are people like Rahab who actually turn and say, no, I want the God to be my Lord too, and then they stay, right? That's why it's really cool in the genealogy of Jesus, you have people who aren't Jewish, right? And because the point of God calling the Israelites to drive them completely out of the land or to have absolutely no influence is not about ethnicity, right? That's why a lot of times people just think it's about ethnicity. It's about religion. It's about their faiths that aren't compatible, right? It's about preventing idolatry and compromise, right? We see this. We saw what happened because we know the Israelites, well actually, spoiler, the Israelites did not do what God commanded. And what you have is, for that point on, you have situations where Israelites are both worshiping God and also kind of doing the Canaanite stuff and worshiping Baal and all that kind of stuff, right? So you have that, and it causes so many issues and problems. It's to prevent those future problems. Those future problems extend for hundreds and hundreds and many generations later. And that's what God was commanding. That's what God was trying to avoid, okay? And so, but I do want to say, so this whole idea of like driving the people out, it is not an okay idea today for Christians to even consider because we are under a new covenant, right? This is the old covenant here, right? We have a new and a better covenant with Jesus. So this doesn't really apply to us. Now you might sit there and think, man, I still struggle with this. It's still, sure, you can say this, it kind of makes sense intellectually, but I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, oh, I don't like this at all. That's okay. That's totally fine. I feel the same way. Every time I read through this, every year I read through this, it's always like, oh, here we go. Buckle up. Joshua's going to get real angry, right? You're not supposed to read this and feel good. That's not the point. The point is, yeah, this is some terrible stuff. This is what happens when humanity has sinned and is fallen. This is what happens when humanity says no to the Lord and says, I'm just going to do things my way. It gets real ugly real quick, and any kind of correction is not pretty. Okay? And so as you read this, it's you just want to be aware that you're not supposed to read this and just be like, oh yeah, I'm all on board with this. You're supposed to read it in a way that's just, okay, I guess this is the way it has to be, right? Okay? So that's kind of like the question of, okay, what's really happening here? Now let's actually jump into Joshua, the second half of Joshua chapter 5 all the way through 8. Okay, so Joshua chapters 5 verses 13 all the way through the end of 6 and in 6:27. This is the fall of Jericho. Okay, and that's what we sang about, right? I just want to, real quick, a little something about Jericho. It is one of, if not the first fortified city. It's actually really impressive. We have some pictures here. Let's say, so this is kind of like a artist rendition of what Jericho probably looked like, and with the walls and kind of stuff. Okay, the next picture has what you see now, right? It's like Jericho. You know how like when we were kind of doing Genesis, there wasn't a lot of like archaeological evidence, and so it's hard to kind of know, hey, is this like literal or is this like a narrative and that kind of stuff. Jericho is a real place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's really cool. I would love to visit one day, right? And so that's the aerial view of like the dig site now. You can, if you want to go there. And there's one more. This is kind of like a 3D rendition. If you like put that drawing on top of like the topical map now, which I thought was pretty cool, like where it would have been in where modern Israel now, and that's the Google Maps of where you can go. So, next time you take a vacation, you can consider visiting Jericho. Okay, so Jericho is like a really impressive city, and it's like the first obstacle to getting into the Promised Land, right? It makes sense that first one would be so heavily fortified because the people knew that, hey, if people are going to come into our land, it's going to be through this way. Okay, and so, but before Joshua has that battle, there's something really cool that happens. All right, this is in chapter 5, verse 13 to 14. It says, now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied, but as commander of the Lord of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? And so this is an angel, right? And the really cool thing is, now remember, God is telling Joshua, hey, this is the promised land. I'm going to give you this land. You're going to be successful in your conquest and that kind of stuff. And yet when Joshua asks this angel's like, I'm not on anybody's side, right? Wait, what's going on? And I think, we use that term sometimes. God is on our side, right? So if God is on our side, who can be against us? Right? But I think we fail to ask the question, are we on God's side? Because I think that's the problem. A lot of times, and the Israelites are showing that, Joshua's showing this, he's going into this with a very like me and us mentality. God is on my side. We are going to go and take this land, and we're going to create a nation for the Lord. Hooray! Okay, great. But are the Israelites on God's side? In your life, do you kind of go through life with your goals and plans and all the stuff you're doing? Is your attitude thinking, oh man, I'm praying about this because I really hope God is going to be on my side and it's going to help me do better on my better in school, better in my career, better raising my kids? Like, is that how we're thinking about it? Because I think that mentality is actually not what we're supposed to have as followers of Jesus. That we should be asking the question, wait, am I on God's side here? What is God calling me to do? And am I aligned with that? And so I love that. I love that right before they even get into the land, Joshua has to be reminded of that, where Joshua thinking, hey, are you on our side? Or are you like some angel demon thing that's on the side of the Canaanites? And the angel's like, neither, right? I'm on God's side. And so after that moment, then we see God gives Joshua just the flat out craziest plan to take over a city. In chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, it says, now the gates of Jericho were securely barred, right? It's got thick walls. You're just not going to be able to get through. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. I love how God is using past tense before it happened, because when God says something, it will be done, right? Oh, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its kings and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse. And that just doesn't sound like it's going to work, does it? Right? Like wait. Because most of the times in those ancient days, if you have a walled city, it's, do I go above the wall with, ladders or a siege ramp or something like that? Do I go through the wall because I break it? Or do I go under the wall? One of the cool things they used to do is they would tunnel under the wall, and then they would start a fire under your wall. And because the walls are made out of like dirt and brick and the fire actually almost like bakes the wall and makes it really brittle, and then it breaks and just smashes easily, I thought that's pretty cool. That's like ancient engineering. That's like really clever, right? Because you have to A, tunnel, B, dig a fire, make a chamber big enough for a fire, and if you're to get oxygen into that chamber regularly to keep it going, right? So that's usually, in ancient times, that's how you defeated a fortified city. And God's like, no, I'm going to use like sonic waves, which I remember when I was younger, I saw this like special on like God and science, and they tried to explain that sound could actually do this, and which is like technically true, but if you really think about it, it's like, I think they were stretching it, right? Because this is not like directed sound. No, this is God. This is God doing it, right? So God tells them this plan because it's crazy. And when it works, it is God, right? God is the one who delivers the Israelites. I wonder if this is not real, but like if God's sitting in heaven and he's like brainstorming ideas of what plan to do, and angels are just like, well, why don't you do this? And one angel's like laughing, like, well, just have a march around the city and like yell. God's like, oh, I like that one. Let's do that, Now, here's the thing. If you're wondering, this is just a fun fact, how far do they march? Because when I was younger, I'm thinking, man, watch around the city, and I'm thinking like New York City. It's like, that's going to take you a couple of days. How can you do that? The city itself, if you look at the map and like how big it is, it depends how far away from the wall you're marching, so you don't really know how far they march. But it could be as like small as like half a mile. Some people were estimating like 1.5 miles. So this is not like some giant like hike. Of course, 7 times, that's kind of annoying, right? That 7th day, it's like, oh, really? But it's not that big. And again, we don't know if they're marching like right next to the wall, like, hey, but then people can drop stuff on you. You don't want to do that. So anyways, if you're just picturing in your head, like, how far were they marching every day? Could have been like a half mile to like 1, maybe 1.5 miles, something like that, okay? But the point is that God simply wants the Israelites to obey. That's the point, right? I'm going to give you this crazy plan, and I want you to obey it, because when it works, it has nothing to do with the plan. It has nothing to do with strategy or might. It is God. Okay. And again, going back to what we talked about last week, in God's wrath, there's still an invitation. Right? In this plan is an invitation. The people of Jericho had 7 days to decide, hey, maybe we want to be like Rahab and say, no, the Lord is God. Right? They heard about the Israelites crossing the Jordan River and how the Jordan River dried up. They knew about how God parted the Red Sea for the Israelites all those decades ago. Right? They had time. There's always this invitation. Of course, we know that they didn't take them up on that, and Jericho was defeated, right? And so then we get to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is Achan and the devoted things, and this is another one of those stories where you're just like, I don't feel good about this one, right? So what happened? So after they defeated Jericho, the next city to defeat is a city called Ai. It's not really a city; it's more of a big town. It's not as strong as Jericho. And so the Israelites, when they scouted out, they're like, hey, it's not going to be that hard. We don't need to take everybody. So they went and attacked them, and they were defeated and lost. And this just demoralized all the people. And then they found out that, God is mad because somebody took the devoted things. And so God had designated Jericho to be devoted to destruction. This is one of the places where God says, no, you're going to destroy everything. Right? That's had a big part of God's wrath there. But Achan didn't obey. So there were some things, some treasures or whatever from the battle that he took and kept that he wasn't supposed to. Right? And in chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, it says, the city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. That's Jericho. Only Rahab and her house shall be spared. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble upon it. So before they went into Jericho, they knew they were not supposed to take anything. Right? And then in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, but the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan took some of them, so the Lord's anger burned against them. Okay, so the whole devoted destruction thing, it's about God's judgment and wrath there. Okay, and so the reason why it's a big deal is to keep some of these devoted things is basically like saying, hey, God has said this city is going to be destroyed because it's God's wrath because of the wickedness of the city. And to keep those things is basically saying, hey, all those things that are wicked and evil, I like them. I'm going to keep it. Right? So it's really symbolic, and to keep them is a really serious offense because it goes against who God is and what God is trying to do. It's saying the things that are wicked and evil I like and I am going to keep in my life. Okay, so that's why it's so serious, and therefore the consequences are really serious for Achan as well. And again, when you read this, you're not supposed to feel good about what happened. Like you're not supposed to read this and say, Achan, oh yeah, kill him. You're not supposed to read. You're supposed to read it and say, Achan, what are you doing? Like, don't do that, right? And this whole episode is really it's pointing to how destructive sin is and how how much it takes to deal with it, right? To deal with sin. Because the thing is this, if you don't deal with sin, the consequences are much worse, okay? I think that a great example is this, is thinking about children who are never disciplined. Like if they come from extreme privilege and they are just given everything, those children, when they grow up to adults, aren't just spoiled, they're like monsters, right? They are so entitled, and they become like really a terrible person, right? If no one ever like disciplines them and kind of sets like boundaries in their lives. And so, this is one of those things where God's like, you can't let this go because of how serious it is. Even though from our sinful humans' perspective, we're like, but that's kind of how it is. I wonder if when we look at stuff like this, and I'm trying to think of like what attitude does God have? There was a movie back in like the 90s called Black Hawk Down, and it was about like basically a bunch of American soldiers are trying to like arrest this warlord, and then during the arrest, one of their Black Hawks got shot down, and the whole movie is about, and it's based on a true story, right? So the whole movie is about the Americans trying to rescue their people and get out of there because the whole city is, and all the militias are like, hey, let's attack, right? And there's a scene at the end where there's a group who kind of like don't have the opportunity to get into these armored trucks. They basically had to run home because the American base is just outside the city. So they're like literally just running, and this is like real, right? And they're like running, trying to defend themselves, run some more, trying to defend themselves, all the way back to the base. And there's a scene, now this is probably fiction, but there's a scene where there's an American soldier who's, he's run ahead, he's now turned around guarding, and then there's one of the militia people who have been killed, and this woman is kind of running up to the dead soldier and is about to take up his gun. And the woman doesn't know that like the American soldiers are watching all this, and the American soldier is just saying, don't do it, don't you do it, because he knows that if the woman were to take that weapon and start to use it against the other American soldiers, like he's gonna have to shoot her. He doesn't want to, right? Because nobody wants to do that, and so he's just sitting there going, watching it, saying, don't do it, don't you do it. And I wonder if that is kind of like the attitude in the heart of God as he sees people just descend into such sin and wickedness and madness. He's saying like, listen, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But if we choose that, God has to respond. Okay. And so, again, like, as we're watching and reading about some of this the destruction God has commanded because of his wrath, and seeing Achan, like we're not supposed to feel good about it. We're supposed to see like, oh, like don't do it. And of course, we also want to look at our own lives and say, oh no, we are Achan. We are the ones that are sinning and turning against God. Like that's us. And so then we get to chapter 8. That's the last chapter doing. This is, so after they deal with Achan, it's Ai, the city of Ai, and the covenant renewed, right? So this time they attack Ai again after they clear up the Achan issue, and they're able to defeat Ai, right? And it's interesting, this time God actually allows them to keep some of the things, right? So again, the things devoted to destruction, that was just specifically for Jericho. When they defeat Ai, they are allowed to keep some of that stuff, right? But afterwards, they pause and regroup and renew the covenant at Mount Ebal, right? And this is kind of like last week, where there's this pause to rest, refocus, and remember what God has done, right? And this kind of keeps us from going off the rails. The same point as last week, where if we don't ever stop sometimes and just pause and reflect and really think about what God has done, that's actually kind of like part of what church is about, that we come together on a weekly basis and pause and just worship. That's kind of what it is. Like, if we don't do that, we kind of go off the rails. Okay, I want to give a final note before we just kind of wrap up, is this. Going back to we read chapter 8, verse 35 already. We're going to read it again. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them, right? Even the foreigners, right? God's people and family is open to anyone, right? So in these chapters where there's so much fighting and destruction and death, there's this invitation, the invitation to come and be part of God's family. And so that's what we want to focus on, because a lot of times we just focus on the action and or just like, but in it, there's this beautiful invitation for God to say, no, like the way you guys have lived and the way humanity has done things is so destructive. There's a better way. Come and be a part of it. And so for us today, I think there's a couple things. I think the first thing is just reiterate, we as Christians today are never called to violence and force. Now, I'm not saying like pacifism here. I'm saying we are never called to violence and force to make people kind of worship and follow the Lord. Okay, that is not how God does things, right? So I feel like I shouldn't need to say that, but I do think there is this like spirit in some parts of in the Christian world that kind of likes that, because it's actually easier. Like if you just make people do stuff, it's much easier than to convince them, right? But that is not that is we don't have that, right? We are not called to that. The second thing is that God is sovereign and will achieve his plans, right? It doesn't matter whether it's in the past or present. God is still sovereign. He has his plans. It will be done. You in your and me in our sinfulness will not stop God's plan. And we in all of our effort will not be able to further it any more than God will do. Okay, that's important to know, because sometimes we think that, oh, God, if I don't do this, if I don't serve, then nothing happens. And it's like, yeah, so, but God's plan, it will get done. You in all your work is not going to further God's plan, and you in your sinfulness is not going to thwart it, right? It doesn't matter that it doesn't mean that we should sit there and be like, well, then I don't need to do anything, right? But we also have to understand God is sovereign. And the last thing is this: God's mercy outweighs his wrath. That's so important, because in this, if we just focus on the battles, it is tough to listen to and tough to watch play out. But in it, God's mercy is greater, right? All along the way, God is giving us and the people back in those ancient days time. He's inviting us to join in. And so if you're sitting there and you've never done that, God is still continuing to invite you into his kingdom, into his family, right? And if you've never done that and you don't understand what that means, definitely talk to me or talk to Pastor Dan. But that's really it. If you think about like, hey, what is this Christian thing all about? It's not about like, oh, these are the rules you want to follow and that kind of stuff. It's this. Hey, God created things in a perfect way, and it got messed up by sin. And God is sovereign, so He's gonna take care of it at one point, and He wants you to be a part of that. He wants you to be part of His family, but He's not going to force you, right? And so that is always the invitation that's there. That's like the gospel in a nutshell, And the way to be a part of His family is through Jesus. And so if that's something you're like, oh, is that? I just thought it was a prayer or something like that. Definitely come and talk to me or Pastor Dan. Okay, but let's pray.